Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Tokyo College webinar. My name is Flavia Baldari, a project researcher here at Tokyo College, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. Before we begin, one quick remark for the audience. If you prefer to listen to today's lecture in Japanese, please select the Japanese button for live English to Japanese interpretation at the bottom of your screen. It is my pleasure to moderate today's special event because we are launching and celebrating the publication of a book, this one, that my colleague, a postdoctoral fellow here at Tokyo College, Dr. Dada DOCOT, has co-edited. The book is an edited collection titled Plural Entanglements, Philippine Studies, published by the Ateneo de Manila University Press last May. This area study collection addresses some of the discussion often related to the field, particularly its colonial origins, the positionality of its scholars, and its direction. This publication is the first collection on Philippine studies after a long time. Differently from previously published Philippine studies books, the frame from for this publication is plural and diverse. It's a conversation of a collection of differently located voices, as the editors put it. All the contributors and the editors are Filipino, which is the first, and their backgrounds and field of expertise are diverse. Among others, archaeology, as we will see later, history, religion, politics, and migration, and so on. But I will let today's speakers to give a better and more just introduction to the book. Regarding today's program, first, Dr. Dada DOCOT will give an overview of the collection, highlighting the crucial topics of the book. Then we will listen to the talk by Dr. Grace BARRETTO-TESORO, a contributor to the volume. After these two talks, we welcome a commentary by Professor Sato from the University of Tokyo. The remaining time will be used for discussion, and if we have time at the end, we will have a short Q&A session. So one quick note for the webinar audience. You can write your questions anytime using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So first, let me introduce my colleague, Dr. Dada DOCOT, one of the three editors of this new collection. Dr. DOCOT is a postdoctoral fellow here at Tokyo College, the University of Tokyo. She is a decolonial anthropologist of the hometown and the Filipino diaspora. She received her PhD in anthropology from the University of British Columbia in 2018, where she co-founded the UBC Philippine Studies series. Dada, the floor is yours. Okay.
Let me just share my slides. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. I would like to begin with some important acknowledgements. First, my deepest gratitude to Dr. Masashi Haneda for his support and mentorship during my fellowship at Tokyo College, the University of Tokyo. My fellowship at Tokyo College has given me the writing time that I needed to contribute to this collection as a co-editor and chapter author. The edited collection, Plural Entanglements, Philippine Studies, published by Ateneo de Manila University Press, was first launched in May 2023. I am also grateful to my colleagues at Tokyo College for facilitating today's high launch of our book. I am especially grateful to my colleague, Dr. Flavia Baldari, for taking the lead in organizing today's event. In today's launch, I am covering some parts of the introductory chapter of the collection. Our chapter is titled Extending the Conversation, Recent Explorations in Philippine Studies. I co-wrote the chapter with my fellow editors, Dr. Stephen Acabado, Professor of Anthropology at University of California, Los Angeles, and Dr. Clement Castigador Camposano, Chancellor of the University of the Philippines, Visayas. The collection is a COVID-19 project initiated by Dr. Stephen Acabado in 2020 with the advice of his mentor, historian Patricio Abenales. I first joined the project as an author of one of the chapters and was later invited as one of its editors. In its pre-publication, we contributed to the project from three places. Dr. Acabado was in Los Angeles, California, Dr. Camposano was in Visayas, Philippines, and myself in Tokyo. I would also just like to give you an outline of my presentation. I will first begin with outlining a brief context of the formation of Philippine Studies and Area Studies. Second, I would like to give a brief introduction of the outdated lowland and highland binary in mapping the Philippines. And third, talk about how scholars have discussed the Philippines in tropes and negatives. Number 4, I would like to talk briefly about the universalist discourse when discussing the Philippines. And I think we could also apply this in various areas in area studies. And fifth, I would like to give a rundown of the themes that we discuss in our collection, and also the chapter previews. And finally, I chose some of the directions that the book offers. Please allow me to zoom out a little bit on the field that is now commonly known as area studies. Historian Vicente Rafael argues that the formation of area studies is connected to US political and military interest post-World War II in the Asia Pacific. And building area scholars as a field, US academia, according to Hall, designed a brand of training that was based elsewhere. This was a pursuit that was once common mostly among anthropologists. Rafael writes that American emphasis on building field-based expertise Sorry, let me just mute myself. Rafael writes that American emphasis on building field-based expertise led to the formation of scholars' field sites as a laboratory and a site for gaining credentials. Area studies, beyond nurturing scholarly interests, also became a space where people could pursue a quote-unquote civic vocation, turning scholars into political experts on affairs in countries that are not their own. Asia is a particular favorite among scholars from the US and Europe. In 1994, in an introduction to a collection on Southeast Asia, featuring scholars who are not from the region, yet write using we in their scholarship, Rafael asks quite bluntly, who is this we? Rafael suggests that area study scholars, particularly scholars of Asia, have not yet thoroughly reflected on their positionality and intellectual engagement with Asia and their contributions to discipline formation as entangled with notions of power, privilege, and access to resources. Zooming in closer to the Philippines, scholars are also troubled by questions on what it should be and where it is, considering the variety of topics that could be covered both in the Philippines and the Filipino diaspora. The Filipino diaspora cannot be disregarded in Philippine studies, as about 10% of the Filipino population live and work overseas. Scholars have also debated the origins of Philippine studies. Others trace its foundation in the early 1900s to American colonial arrival, when the US, needing to know about its newly colonized lands in the Pacific, dispatched scholars to translate documents and gather knowledge about the Philippines. To name one, Cornell University President Jacob Sherman was appointed head of the first Philippine Commission. Other scholars, meanwhile, say that its beginnings can be traced to the European missionaries who first sexualized the Philippines for colonial governance and missionization, creating the body of archives that Philippine studies scholars draw from today. From this context, Philippine studies emerged as a field that is connected to colonial interests. Philippine studies as an artifact of colonial interest continues to shape the production of the Philippines today as a field. This is seen in the ways that Filipinos today, no longer as field research assistants and translators, produce knowledge based on geographical divisions created by colonists. After Spain ceded the Philippines to Spain to the US in 1898, anthropologist and American colonial administrator Dean Worcester divided the archipelago into lowland versus highland, which was meant to justify the civilizing mission in the so-called highlands, which was often rendered wild in comparison to the quote-unquote civilized lowlands. And of course, we also have to remember that when I say wild here, it's in quotes. So until today, studying one's community within the realm of Philippine studies remains a marginal pursuit even among Filipino scholars. At the 2021 Anthropological Association of the Philippines Conference, Romeo Turing Jr. and Maria Mangajas spoke about their recent research that cataloged 214 articles in UGAT's official journal, published since its founding from 1978 to 2020. By geotagging the ethnographic field sites of all articles published in the journal, Turing and Mangajas established what many scholars in Philippine studies already knew, but did not have a basis yet, that most Filipino anthropologists are Manila-based, and that they account for 89% of a total of scholars in the field. And their projects tend to concentrate on particular indigenous communities, the same areas that colonial administrators and scholars mapped in the early years of their arrival as a justification for civilizing the new colony. The discourse of development in the 50s in the Philippines, with a lot of scholarship focusing on agricultural and peasant communities and their application of introduced technologies that were meant to continue to transform formerly colonized countries as a source of competitively priced agricultural resources, was also visible in the turn of Philippine scholarship. Then and now, the Philippines is often described negatively. Renata Rosaldo, in 1998, wrote that even his former supervisor did not encourage him to focus on the Philippines. As we know, Rosaldo emerged as a well-cited favorite among American anthropologists for his work in the northern Philippines. He said that his supervisor wanted him to focus instead on other exotic cultures or countries like Madagascar, because he was told that the Philippines has no culture as it is too hybrid, and that he would perhaps be more productive if he focuses on other places. The sentiment of the Philippines as a place of negatives also appeared in public-facing pieces such as American journalist James Fallows, who referred to Filipino culture in 1987 as quote-unquote damaged, and with this damaged culture as the main barrier, he said, to development in the Philippines. Through education and popular media, these negatives have become deeply embedded in the Filipino mind, as I have also observed recently in my 2021 article amid COVID-19, when many neighborhoods gathered resources like food and others to share with their neighbors who have lost jobs and who needed help during the pandemic. Despite the wonderful display of solidarity and generosity via these community-organized pantries, many Filipinos critiqued the effort and raised self-deprecating myths about our supposed laziness and dependence as barriers to our self-sufficiency. A preoccupation in Philippine studies descends from scholarly engagement with outdated debates about culture and notions of it being pure or damaged in classic anthropology and area studies. Scholars of Japan, I think, also struggle with the tropes created by canonical anthropological concepts, such as the ones proposed by Ruth Benedict in her book, Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which rendered Japanese cultures in so-called cultural patterns. In the case of Philippine studies, personality theory introduced by Jesuit priest and anthropologist Frank Lynch in the early 60s reverberates even in contemporary scholarship that deconstructs Filipino interpersonal relations as quote-unquote smooth. There is a need to shed residual obsessions with constructivism, which tends to trap the studied other in a vacuum, as if they were resistant to long-standing oppression and thus unchanging. A branch of scholarship produced locally and reproduced beyond Philippine shores in the last 4 decades tended to read so-called values using analytical concepts such as utang na loob or debt of gratitude. Utang na loob, for example, is the debt that children owe to their parents or that students owe to their teachers, and there are many other examples. Utang na loob is a kind of debt that can never be repaid, according to personality theory, and it is said to burden Filipino relationships as it can keep them in an endless loop of accountability, gift-giving, and other supposedly archaic relations. This concept, as well as others, however, renders Filipinos as supposedly easily readable subjects, if not already understood and known, as if the context in which interpersonal relationships occur are not complex or not hampered by enduring class and global inequality, and thus need a more elaborate contextualization that cannot be summed up with concepts such as utang na loob that are then blamed for messy, intimate politics, or that the emergence of corruption and other forms of violence are now continuing to use utang na loob discourse. So whenever Filipinos appear to be violent to each other, such discourses like utang na loob are used to critique Filipinos as abusive against their own. A break in Philippine studies came in the 1970s when Filipino scholars came to turn to what was called an indigenization process. Scholars re-examined Western theoretical canons in Philippine studies to debunk myths about the generalized Filipino culture, which, as mentioned in the previous slides, often painted Filipino and their universalized culture in harmful negatives. This project, however, translated Western concepts, methods, and theory, but primarily into the hegemonic Tagalog language. However, Filipino scholars eventually realized the failure of merely borrowing concepts in their translated form. They thus began to produce a body of knowledge that includes indigenous concepts and methods, producing schools of thought such as Psikolohiyang Pilipino or Filipino psychology, which envisioned a movement in Philippine studies underpinned by a mapagpalaya or liberating framework. Another movement that emerged was called Pantayong Pananaw, or From Us, For Us perspective, which was a theoretical framework that was decidedly insular, yet I think problematic, as analysis are initiated by supposedly genuine Filipinos for themselves and for their own liberatory project. Some scholars critiqued this framework for its exclusionary stance and fixation on a nationalist and totalizing imaginary that took for granted hybridity in the Philippines caused by the country's multiple colonial and ethno-linguistic encounters. Some scholars within the movement also tended to exclude the Filipino diaspora and works by Filipino scholars, thus Filipino scholars in the diaspora, thus ignoring the increasing mobility of Filipinos beyond its shores as a legitimate theme in advancing Philippine studies. Rethinking widely used theoretical concepts in Philippine studies is a part of the works of scholars today. To do so involves decolonizing our practices as scholars. While there are many decolonial scholars, Ramon Grossfugel offers 3 steps for scholars of area studies, and these are: number 1, expand citation practices beyond the canon. Second, recognize a pluriversal instead of a universal world. And third, engage with people from the so-called global South, not as mere research subjects, but as knowledge producers. Having given a survey of the context of the emergence of the broader field of area studies and the creation of Philippine Studies more specifically, I now summarize some of the themes that the chapters in the collection engage with. So first is some standpoint theory. Chapters in our collection represent some post-colonial and diasporic scholars' engagement with standpoint theory. Second is interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. I think it has become increasingly important for scholars to engage inter and multidisciplinarity as a way of widening its readership. Our collection acknowledges this necessity by bringing together scholars from diverse fields to engage with each other. Second is transformative praxis. Some scholars separate practice from their scholarship, but authors from our collection and but also other Philippine scholars in general tend to bridge theory with action, which means that we see scholarship and practice as intertwined pursuits. They are not separate from each other. Decolonization. There are, of course, many definitions of decolonization by scholars from different fields. And we can discuss more of that later in the Q&A if the audiences are interested. But in the case of the Philippines, scholars often struggle with colonial narratives that have become national meta-narratives. Dr. BARRETTO-TESORO will speak more about this in her presentation. Next is post-colonial hybridity. Understanding indigeneity was a common theme in earlier iterations of Philippine studies. Contemporary Indigenous studies scholars investigate indigeneity today with the understanding that Indigenous identity is not static and has been transformed by the Philippines' multiple colonial history and colonial encounter. And finally, agency. The agency of the subjects of research and area studies appears as a persistent debate, especially in post-colonial countries where daily life remains haunted by global injustice. In this sixth part of my presentation, I will be going through 4 slides, which feature all the titles of each chapter in the collection and the last name of the authors below the titles. I won't be reading them one by one. Instead, as I pause, please scan each slide and read the titles and perhaps look out for keywords that might be of interest to you. We won't have time to discuss all of them today, but I hope this outline provides a glimpse into the themes of the collection, which we have divided into 4 sections. The first section offers chapters with a broad theme titled Deep History and Global Connections. The second section of the book is titled Indigenous Philippines with 4 titles. And then the third one is the nation state. And the last section is titled The Philippines as a Plural Place with 3 chapter offerings. So finally, I should also note that our collection opens and closes with text by 2 of the most esteemed scholars of the Philippines and the Filipino people today, historians Dr. Carol Howe at Kyoto University and Dr. Vicente Rafael at the University of Washington. Their forward and afterword to the book add much needed context to the introduction that myself, Dr. Acabado, and Dr. Campusano wrote in the introduction. So finally, the chapter offerings in this collection hope to contribute to the long history of decolonial scholarship in the Philippines and Filipino scholars' work in the last 4 decades. We respectfully nod to a long genealogy of anti-colonial and decolonial work by Filipinos by bringing together chapters written from a range of perspectives and positionalities as teachers, community workers, activists, political commentators, artists, etc., which complicates what being and becoming native means today in the Philippines. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Dada, for your insightful introduction to the meaning of Philippine Studies and for the overview of the book. Today, as I said before, we are also welcoming a contributor to the collection, Dr. Grace BARRETTO-TESORO. She currently serves as the director of the Archaeological Studies program at the University of the Philippines. She received her PhD in archaeology at the University of Cambridge in 2007. Please, Dr. BARRETTO-TESORO, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will share my screen now. So, good afternoon to all. Today, I will be presenting the most recent study on the chronology of Philippine archaeology. This chapter was co-written by Dr. Stephen Acabado from the University of California, Los Angeles, who is in the field at the moment. This is the outline of my presentation. To discuss the background of the article, we'll explain why we did this. The context of this presentation is to understand Philippine archaeology using a framework that is most suitable to the available Philippine data. The proposed framework allows regional connections. The 3H system, which was developed in Europe, became a dominant cultural chronology in the world. This system arranges archaeological materials from the oldest to the youngest based on their raw materials. The understanding is that materials that were produced using a basic technology are the oldest, and those produced using a more complex technology are younger. The general view is from simple to complex, each stage progressing to a more evolved stage, which many have understood to interpret older materials and younger materials as products of civilized societies. Many scholars in the Philippines have already developed a chronology based on the 3H system, which was, of course, based on the available data at the time of their research. So we have anthropologists, archaeologists, just to fit a foreign framework. Traditional Philippine chronology is undoubtedly linear, as it overlooks the persistent use of raw materials and artifacts, as well as the diversity of the archaeological record. A within perspective incorporates local views on archaeological materials, oral histories, and indigenous epistemologies. Integrating views from both local and indigenous perspectives enriches our understanding of human artifact relationships and make archaeology more meaningful. We examine how Philippine materials reveal how past behavior developed within the regional context of Southeast Asian archaeology. At the same time, breaking regional and disciplinary boundaries that have characterized Philippine archaeology. To incorporate recent anthropological findings in the last decade or so, the first period that we propose is in Philippine archaeology would refer to the arrival of humans in the islands as the early humans period. It is during this period that witnessed the appearance of early hominins based on excavations in Rizal in Kalinga, Calao Cave in Cagayan Valley, and Tabon in Palawan. So archaeologically, the early humans period, which is everything before 12,000 years ago, is characterized by several stone tool complexes. Probably there was wood and bamboo also, but right now, no wooden tools have been recovered in the Philippines. However, ethnoarchaeology and experimental archaeology demonstrate that bamboo is an efficient cutting tool. Using the term early humans designation will link the Philippines to the wider discussion of human origins and diversity in Southeast Asia. If we shift away our focus from technology we have a wider understanding of early humans in the Philippines and their connections in East Asia, such as the Homo floresiensis and most recently the Homo sapiens in Laos. The next period The next period we labeled as Maritime Contacts. This is from 12,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago. It is in other models, this is often called the Neolithic, and it is closely associated with the Austronesian migration. Focusing on Austronesians overlooks other lifeways and populations during that time. During this period, there was an increased presence of shell tools, indicating exploitation of oceanic resources. Shell tool technology, obsidian from the same geological source, and flexed burial traditions were recorded over a wide area. We argued that there was an active maritime regional network and population movements that can correspond to an earlier population called the Nusantao, way before 4,000 years ago. The wide distribution of artifacts implied the migration of peoples over wider distances separated by open seas. During this period, rice domestication was interpreted to be present. But at the moment, recent data challenges this argument because of the absence of wet rice evidence. Objects associated with the hypothesized Austronesian package, composed of red slip pottery, stone adzes, notched pebble sinkers, spindle whorls, nephrite ornaments, animal remains of dogs, pigs, chickens, and water buffalo and commensal rats, and rice agriculture were perceived to have moved as one. But at the moment, they have never been found together in one site. It is most probably that rice was a prestige crop rather than a steady source of carbohydrates, and so were the pigs and dogs that were consumed as prestige or ritual animals. The Austronesian migration does not capture the diversity of archaeological complexes in the country. Rather, the Austronesian migration should be seen as an example of maritime travel over large distances. Using the label Maritime Contacts allows for multiple and broad subsistence scenarios, including marine exploitation. This period also exhibited complex human behavior, which includes a 9,000-year-old cremations practice and preconceived half-dead stone tool from northern Palawan during the terminal Pleistocene to the early Holocene. The next period saw the growth of communities founded on the shared maritime culture that facilitated the emergence of burial practices that appear to represent the cosmology of the people during this time. In the dominant Philippine chronology, this period is referred to as the Metal Age, but it is really defined by the manufacture and use of highly decorated and atypical pottery that are generally associated with burials, either as receptacles or votives. We refer to this period as the complex burial traditions, and it is characterized by elaborate burial traditions across the archipelago, which includes securely dated jar burial traditions. The next period, we refer to the early historical period. It is from 1,000 years ago to 1400 of the Common Era. It witnessed the introduction of foreign wares and beads to the Philippines through intensive exchange between local populations and foreign traders. In the popular chronology, this period was known as the Porcelain Age or Protohistoric period. The high volume of trade ware in archaeological sites, including looted ceramics, demonstrate the extensive scale of regional trade during this period. Ceramic evidence from shipwrecks, archaeological sites, and even from private collections mark a change from the use of local pottery as burial receptacles and offerings. One of the most important aspects in the Philippine cultural history is the contribution of the Islamic contacts, starting in the 14th century, but previously overlooked. Islamic pilots and Muslim traders initiated the rapid spread of Islam in the region a century before Spanish contact in the 16th century. The fact that the Spanish constructed many watchtowers as defensive structures against raiders from southern Philippines affirmed the role of Islamic groups during this period. It is our hope that more archaeological correlates could be identified in future investigations to develop a more inclusive Philippine archaeology. As the period is characterized by exchange, gold rose to prominence in these interactions. Gold trade networks existed in northwestern Luzon, highlighting other trade networks during this period. From the 1400 onwards until 1830, we refer to this period as the early modern period. It is described by the shift of the nature of trade from exchange to commerce. In the Philippines, this coincided by the appearance and subsequent conquest of the Spanish in the Philippines. Using the early modern period would bring Philippine chronology to regional historical discussions and break the arbitrary disciplinary boundaries. This period saw widespread landscape changes due to resource extraction and urbanization. Urbanization is demonstrated by stone and stone-based structures that started to emerge in the late 1500s, associated with the Spanish colonial occupation. There were constructions of churches, stone-based houses, forts, lighthouses, bridges, roadways, loading docks, and cemeteries that transformed the physical and social landscapes. Town layout centered on the church and town hall, simultaneously altering social relations and social order, such as administrative, religious, and trade. These stone structures involved quarrying, mining, and transporting raw materials, clearing of paths, creating roads to allow transport to places that were not reached through water, and of course, labor that was required to source raw materials and to build the structures. Asian ceramics continued to dominate this period despite the Manila galleon trade that brought American and European goods. Manila ware, a high-fired local pottery produced during this period, imitated European forms. These are other examples of artifacts that arrived in the Philippines due to global trade. This period also saw the start of widespread written documentation on the daily lives of different indigenous groups living in the islands. It was argued that groups such as those inhabiting the Cordilleras of Luzon and Mindanao who resisted the colonial system have been, in quotation marks, unconquered. This mindset perpetuates discrimination because they were not Christianized. Hence, in quotation marks, uncivilized. Recent work demonstrates the complex economic strategies of the Ifugao to be actively part of the colonist network without being subjugated. The reference to the early modern period signals the incorporation of indigenous groups to the increasing globalized world, facilitated by resource extraction and maritime commerce. So why did we write this paper? The proposed new chronology just presented focus on human behavior based on archaeological evidence. Our proposal emphasizes practices and activities associated with the archaeological record. Relying on a material-centered framework limits our understanding of the past as we are obliged to fill in social and cultural stages that are not supported by Philippine data. The new chronology highlights human agency and social relations within the Philippines, in the Southeast Asian region, and even with Europe and the Americas. We treat the past as a social arena with varied human activities and not as static objects that are trapped in a cultural stage. The persistence of forms and raw materials should be appreciated in their new context rather than considering them as anomalies. Some terms in previous chronologies should be retired due to their colonial implications and non-applicability. This proposed chronology has a broad working framework. We still need robust radiocarbon modeling and statistical clustering to link observed human behavior and artifactual patterning. Data integration should also be complemented by local and regional patterning to illustrate social change rather than to focus on typological evolution of artifacts. Proposing a new chronology is an academic exercise, but should be made relevant by incorporating locals' understanding of the archaeological evidence. The core of archaeology is community. The practice of archaeology is always connected to identity and nation building. At the same time, we must not forget that multiple voices should be heard and diversity should be celebrated. This new proposed chronology attempts to understand cognitive and behavioral complexities, technological, social, and cosmological activities through time. We should focus on why sites were formed, why objects were manufactured and used, and what they mean for the people who made and used them. If we highlight the meanings of artifacts to the people who produce and use them, it reframes our understanding how cultures develop through time, because they are evaluated and synthesized through local and indigenous lens. Thank you for listening. I would like to thank the following individuals who helped in the production of this article and of the book. Thank you very much.
Okay, my name is Jin Sato. I'm a professor at the Institute for Advanced Studies on Age at the University of Tokyo. Thank you so much for inviting me to this event. I would first like to congratulate Dada and the editors for putting together such a wide-ranging book on Philippine studies. I read all of them and I enjoyed reading them. All of the chapters are very rich, and I particularly like the sense of mission that sort of runs through all the chapters, which is really to challenge the dominance of Western scholarship and the way we think about a variety of phenomena that happens at the local level from a perspective of the indigenous people or the local population. Actually, I myself, I'm now putting together a book on untranslatable development concepts in Japan, in Japanese, and also asking this question, why certain terms are so difficult to translate into English and their significance and beyond Japan studies or beyond the geographical boundary of Japan. So I really I really sort of enjoyed reading the book, and I'm hoping to have, like, in the future, you know, more communication on this point. I'm no expert on the Philippine studies, and so my capacity today is really to ask you questions from an amateur perspective, and one of the privileges of being an amateur is you ask questions that you cannot answer by yourself. So and the questions that I listed, I have 4 questions, and many of them, most of them, those are the questions that I myself have been struggling So I hope this will open up some discussion with the floor later on. Should I show the slide by myself, or can you? You can? Okay. So I have 4 questions. Let me start with the first. And the first is the role of English in indigenization process or decolonization process. Unlike in the Philippines, where English is common, Japan struggled a lot. And it's really surprising that in the 1870s to 1880s on this campus at the University of Tokyo, more than 70% of the courses were taught in English. And Meiji government invested a lot to replace those English taught or European language taught courses to Japanese. And so in 20 years or so, by 1890 or so, most of the classes were taught in Japanese, and we were proud of it. But 100 years later, we are now trying to re-Englishinize, I don't know what's the term, but we're trying to go back to this English teaching and research and things like that. So it's kind of a historical irony. But the point is, Japan has been struggling a lot with English. And maybe thanks to the fact that we have enough audience in Japanese, enough readers of Japanese, enough listeners of Japanese, maybe this environment helped preserve some local concepts without being pushed by the English sort of way of thinking. In the original form. So I'm wondering, how did the early adoption of English in the Philippines affect the status of local concepts, which I think is quite different from the situation in Japan, which was a country that has been quite, we were not imposed English, but we're kind of, English has always been our foreign language. So if you could touch on that, the role of the English in indigenization process, that'd be great. My second point is related to the first, which is the place of Japan in your effort to overcome Western dominance. I didn't see much reference to Japan in the book. I'm wondering whether Japan is treated as part of the West, or is it it could be an alternative model, or it's an irrelevant other that doesn't need, that doesn't quite factor in your discussion, especially with regard to your sort of intellectual challenge against the Western scholarship. I'm asking this question especially because, Dada, you stayed quite some time, in Japan, and you're familiar with the environment here. So, and then this book launch is happening in Tokyo. So if you could comment on the role of Japan, how you view Japan in your framework as a Philippine area studies specialist trying to sort of counter Western scholarship. Does Japan serve as some kind of a reference point? That's my second question. My third question is more, it's kind of a selfish question because I'm coming more from a policy perspective, a social science perspective, is the policy implication of area studies. Some chapters are very policy relevant chapters, like the one on natural disaster, for example. But as you know, policies require normative direction. So my question is, how does a deeper and plural understanding of a place, which you try to do and you try to demonstrate in this book as a whole, go along with addressing practical problems like natural disasters or environmental issues in a timely manner? Now, I know that unless you understand local context, you cannot have a very effective policy. I know that. But I still see the tension between your emphasis on diversity and plurality in sort of promoting the Philippine studies as an area study, and the topic you deal with, the practical things, the disaster environment, all those things that require immediate kind of intervention. which may kind of, may not allow, embracing variety of ways to look at it. So I just want to sort of highlight the potential tension between practical issues that you're dealing with in this book and the general approach of area studies that appreciates diversity and plural understanding. And finally, and which is related to the third point, is the disciplinary identity of area studies. And related to my third point, I'm going to challenge you by saying, is plurality enough to claim the presence and the significance of area studies as an academic field? I wonder whether area study requires some kind of a methodological unity or methodological kind of a thread that instead of just claiming all, area studies would allow capturing, variety of, context that cannot be understood by single discipline, things like that. That's correct. But I'm not sure whether that's the way to go to sort of play up or highlight the sort of strength of area studies as a discipline. I think it's a successful experiment, a successful case to challenge the existing disciplines. But what about area studies as a discipline? Are you trying to promote area studies as a discipline? And then if that's the case, then are you eventually trying to come up with some kind of a methodological unity that can be compared with disciplines like political science or economics, or are you trying something totally different? So those are the questions I have, and I hope I know I've asked a lot of selfish questions because I don't come from Philippine Studies, but I hope this will open up some discussions. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Sato, for your rich commentary. And before open the discussion among the authors, that I would like to invite also Dr. BARRETTO-TESORO to turn her camera on. I would like to also apologize with the audience for the audio trouble. I hope everything is fine now. And we also had some connection trouble. So Dr. BARRETTO-TESORO had to reshare her screen. So I want to apologize with the audience for that. I hope it will go smoothly from now on. So if Dada and also Grace want to try to start reply to the rich question Dr. Sato, Professor Sato posed. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Sato, for your comments and also for coming today. I know you're very busy, so it's a pleasure to engage with you today. Is it okay if I start, Grace?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So shall we start with the role of English? The first question. So the role of English in Philippine studies and area studies in general. I think the answer to your question would probably depend on who is from which field the scholar is coming from. For example, in one of the slides, I mentioned that there was an indigenization movement in the Philippines, especially those coming from the field of Pantayong Pananaw, or the From Us, For Us movement. It was a liberatory project, and a lot of scholars in that field was writing in Filipino, in the national language of the Philippines. One of them being Tagalog or Filipino. Myself coming from another area in the Philippines called the Bicol region. Even in our own region, there are several languages. So there's the Bicolano language, which I don't speak, even if I claim I'm from the Bicol region. I actually speak another language in the Bicol region called Rinconada. So I think English, my engagement with English is, as a scholar, is that I acknowledge English as a colonial artifact, and that by using English as the language of my scholarship, I am also kind of, it's hard for me to engage with the people that I write for, which is my community. In the Philippines, and in anthropology in general, I consider myself as an anthropologist of the hometown, which means that I try to make my scholarship accessible to the people in my field site, which is my hometown. And I think the Philippines in general, scholars struggle with the dominance of the English language as a colonial artifact, right? The state also would have a different response to your question. I think until today, the state continues to promote the use of English language as in national discourse, but not really sometimes for our interests, but for the interest of the state to be able to promote migrants globally as competitive laborers. I think in the case of the Philippines, Philippine Studies, English kind of has a dominance in the scholarship, but I think we kind of maybe have some benefits in using the English language in terms of readership. As you mentioned, it's different from Japanese studies, but it could also be a struggle for us. For example, in the case of China, because they have a power and privilege, right? During COVID-19, before COVID-19, China had this massive project of promoting the English language in their schools, right? And during COVID-19, when there was a big experience of anti-Asian hate, China, I think, was able to say that we are no longer focusing on the English language, and we are focusing on different languages in Chinese, right? And the Philippines is unable to do that because of our neocolonial relations with the US. We are unable to commit to a full Philippinization or indigenization of our scholarship because of the neocolonial environment that we have found ourselves in. And also the scholars' use of the English language would also have, I think, negative implications or negative effects on the diversity of languages that currently exist in the Philippines, which, as I have said, just in my province alone, there are multiple languages. And it's only in the recent times that we have published language, Rinconada language dictionary. And it's only very recently that we are finally writing in the Rinconada language. And most of these literature are in Spanish, English. So I think they would have their own benefit, but also negative repercussions in the production of scholarship in the Philippines. What do you think, Grace?
Okay. Thank you, Professor Sato, for your question. When I was reading your questions, I think number one, the first question is the most applicable to the line of work that I do. And so English, okay, words are loaded regardless of what language we use, and they're never neutral. As a Filipina who grew up in the Philippines, and I learned English at home and of course in school. And these words, the use of a language affects how you view the world, okay? How you relate to other people and to others within the Philippines and of course outside the Philippines. So using examples in archaeology, like Paleolithic and Neolithic, it confines a lifestyle within this period. It also confines objects that were produced during this period, when in reality, these lifestyles do not change abruptly when a period ends. So when you say in the old chronology, when you say the Neolithic started 4,000 years ago and ended 3,000 years ago, there's no abrupt change in the lifestyle. But actually there is persistence and continuity of lifestyles and materials that we still observe. Some of this, there are traces still in the modern world. Okay. But if we stick with these terms, which are obviously European origins, then there is a limitation of how we view the data. Okay. And when we were colonized by the Spanish, and then they would refer to those who were not conquered, as unhispanized in quotation marks and unchristianized in quotation marks. The implication is, of course, they're not civilized, they remain savages, they are primitive. So that those are all in quotation marks. And because that's the implication of the English words. But if we view it from another perspective, that's why we are pushing for a local perspective / indigenous perspective. It would change how you view the history of the Philippines or the development, the social history of the Philippines. But I don't, in terms of discourses, I think there should always be a discourse in English and a discourse in Filipino and other languages, of course, in the Philippines. The reason why is because we still need to engage with scholars beyond our national borders, and we also need to engage with local scholars. And in the Philippines, which is composed of 100 languages and multiple ethno-linguistic groups, it is important to engage with this with local scholars also and people from different ethno-linguistic groups, because I think that's how knowledge is generated, and that knowledge should be co-produced. Okay? And I think the products of this will make the discussion more dynamic and more productive. So yes, English has an impact on our scholarship. And I have to admit that I, as a scholar, also have, still have inconsistencies because of the background that because of my educational, social background. Because you are brought up in a certain way with a view that English is better, the West is better, and it slips out of you, not accidentally. You're just not aware that sometimes you are guilty of it. But then, as a scholar, you also need to be not militant, but you need to catch yourself so that you are able to review and to assess how you view things. So that's it.
Maybe we can. Thank you. Proceed with the other question.
Okay. Shall we proceed to the second question?
Yeah. I think there's three more, and I'm pretty sure there's a lot. The audience is kind of waiting for their chance to ask questions. So maybe you don't have to kind of go one by one, but if there are certain things that the burning ones that really that you would like to respond, I would appreciate it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd like to respond to the second question because we are here in Japan and we are hosted by the University of Tokyo. So I would like to clarify that for the audience and for everybody who's here. In my presentation, I mentioned several times, I think, multiple colonial encounter, and there was not enough context building provided during the presentation. But when I mentioned multiple colonial encounter, it's with the understanding that the audience know that the colonial encounters that the Philippines has had was 300 years of Spanish colonization, and then about 50 years of American colonialism, and arguably neocolonialism, and then also Japanese occupation during World War II.
Mm.
So it was not explicitly mentioned, but I think Japan is in there in the folds of the presentation, but not outrightly mentioned. And I would like to also say that the absence or the presence of certain countries, I think, in scholarly discourse in the Philippines today may also be affected by the kinds of resource that scholars have had access to. So, for example, myself as a former Mambusha scholar, I received scholarship from Japan in the past to do my master's here, and also an undergraduate exchange back when I was very young. I would say that I think there are certain forms of scholars who have who kind of put a critical or put Japan in their scholarship. just because of the presence of Japan in their life. So, but on the other hand, there's also the lingering presence of America's occupation in their project of benevolent colonialism, which tends to erase, I think, the critical discourses about the US. So in my own project, and I'm currently working on my book, and hopefully it comes out in the future. In my own work, I have seen how, for example, in my hometown, the Japanese occupation seems to be vilified in the minds of the people in my hometown, because it is believed that the Americans, or because of the American discourse of benevolent colonialism, right? We kind of tend to believe that the Americans were kind to us. And that because most of us are still Catholic because of the 300 years, it's a very long influence. And we have also absorbed a lot of Catholic Christian values. We kind of tend to forget, we have forgotten that the Spanish were also very terrible, right? And they have not paid their dues. They have not returned their stolen artifacts. They have not apologized. So I think that it can get very complicated, but in terms of scholarly production, a lot of scholarship is affected by the scholarship that they have received from particular countries, because there is no scholarship in the Philippines funded by the Philippine government, but the Japanese government has funded for a lot of Filipinos to come to Japan since the 1970s, I think, as part of its cool diplomacy, right? The Japanese diplomatic efforts to invite people to study in Japan, and also the US has also done that. So I would just like to say that there are scholars who remain critical of the Japanese occupation. And I think I would also say that, for example, it is often raised, or sometimes raised, that Japan, because there was a question about, is it Western colonialism, right? Is it grouped with American intervention? And I think some scholars would raise, for example, the Japanese occupation in Okinawa, right? Because we also had a US basis occupation in the Philippines. And I think there would also some Filipino scholars would raise the critique that Japan has kind of applied, or has kind of in unity or in solidarity with, I'm not sure if solidarity is the correct word, but it's applying some colonial, US colonial methods in the colonization of Okinawa, for example. So, but it depends on the scholar's paradigm or discourse, I believe.
Thank you. Maybe Grace, do you want to add something, or you would like to address another questions?
I think I would like to answer number 2 question regarding Japan. I agree with Dada. It depends on who you ask. As an archaeologist, if we do work in the field, the Japanese are always seen as the other. Okay? The other meaning as part of as part of the military, and as people looking for treasure. But in the history, in archaeology, we do have a lot of joint research projects, especially with Japanese scholars and the National Museum of the Philippines. And it is challenging when you go to the field, but there are many scholarships, like what Dada also mentioned, there are many scholarships that Japan has offered to Filipino scholars to study in Japan. And beyond that, beyond the scholarship, beyond academe, of course, JICA is also in the Philippines and assists in developmental work. Okay. But I like to focus more on the archaeology field. I think one challenge that we have when interacting or when working with Japanese scholars is the publication, because they tend to write in, of course, in the Japanese language, and use their own script. And it's something, so as a Filipino scholar who is interested in learning more the findings of Japanese scholars in the Philippines, we have, so that's a challenge that we face. So it really depends on who you're asking and who you're interacting with.
Okay, thank you. So maybe we can pick some of the questions from the audience, if it's okay with you. We have one question here. Has local history writing, local archaeology initiatives been encouraged in the Philippines to capture the diversity of situation and thinking in the different parts of the country? Is there support for local, city, provincial, regional, educational institution in this task? Maybe Grace can start.
Yes. Thank you, Flavia. So yes, local history writing and local archaeology initiatives are encouraged right now. There are many historians and scholars looking at different ethno-linguistic groups and different areas outside of Manila in terms of understanding what happened in a place in the context of the nation's history. In terms of support, there is always research money, so that can be a support. But I think with the boom in tourism and heritage work now, it is also many local government units, governors and mayors are supporting research in their areas also. So it depends where you plan to work, but there are like El Nido Palawan. It supports the studies in El Nido, in Mindanao also, and specifically in northern Mindanao, in Misamis Oriental, there is support from the local government. Cagayan Valley, and Kalinga. These are areas where archaeological work has started decades ago, and it's closely being supported and monitored by the local government units.
Yeah, and unfortunately, one of my co-editors, Dr. Stephen Acabado, is not here today, but his archaeological project in northern Philippines has also had significant impact, like immense impact in the community. They have changed the curriculum to integrate archaeological findings, and they built a museum, and with the locals as the main producers of the curriculum. So it could have impact, it can have impact. In May, after the book launch in Manila, I brought the chapter that I wrote in the book about decolonizing post-colonial monuments in my hometown. And I presented the chapter in the local language with people in the hometown as speakers. And there were also invited speakers, invited commentators who were from the church. There was a priest, there were politicians, professors, scholars. And then there was a conversation to perhaps change the local curriculum to integrate some of the ways that we can decolonize the local curriculum, which might not necessarily match the national narrative. So it is possible to receive support from local schools and the local government.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. As someone who hasn't read the book yet, hoping to order it soon, yes, please do. Or would you say Philippine studies in general has been largely independent of political clashes, especially the patronage of political elites, or it is also mostly affected by the political ties of discipline-specific scholarship? I'm inclined to look at political science, economic, and history, especially since they tend to be most mobilized in partisan political narratives as well.
Sorry, which question is it?
By
Hansley Giuliano, I don't know, I'm sorry if I mispronounced it.
Oh, if Philippine studies has been largely independent of political clashes. What do you think, Grace?
From in the field of archaeology, all research is political. Like you mentioned, utang na loob, and I think that governs many of relationships and transactions in the in the Philippines. It would be wise, of course, to navigate carefully between and among the different political elites or political elites in the country. There are cases of a project which did not receive funding for succeeding years because of the change in the municipal mayor, or there would be lukewarm support after if the project was supported by a rival mayor. So it is not so that in terms of practice, of course, it affects our practice, meaning how we conduct our excavations and when we should, who should we approach in requesting for support in any place that we go to. But in terms of interpretation, so far I have not encountered. Of course, it's the fact that we are trying to looking at it from an indigenous perspective means it has been very political from the start. But I would like to specify in terms of archaeological interpretation. So far, I have not encountered any, at least in the field of archaeology, where an interpretation is dictated by a political elite or by to change the course of things. There is a lot of historical revisionism in the Philippines, but let's see where that will lead us. But so that's in the discipline of history. Archaeology-wise, it has been used to by other by people outside the academe who are enthusiasts and they don't have any political connections, but they do affect the scholarship because of social media. So they have discovered the platform of social media, and they do put out a lot of talks and lectures, which sometimes using archaeological materials, but sometimes, well, most of the times that are not scientifically grounded. So these are some of the realities and challenges that we face in the field of archaeology.
Okay, thank you. So we can combine two questions here, one from Hinata Yotaro and the other one from Miura Ryoma. The first one, do you mind if I ask you a question? Why are you interested in studying colonialism in the Philippines? Because I'm interested in Filipino culture. And the other one, what is the goal and the purpose to study Philippine area in the future?
Okay, I think it's really hard to study the present without understanding the past. It's critical, especially for post-colonial places like the Philippines, which was multiply colonized, right? We cannot talk about labor migration. We cannot talk about religiosity, faith, politics without looking at colonial influence, without the influence of the Catholic Church. So I think it gives us a richer perspective if we study colonialism, not only in the Philippines, but in other formerly colonized places and countries which are also still currently settled. By that, I mean the United States, Australia, and other currently settled countries. And the second question, I think, what is the goal and purpose of studying the Philippines as an area studies, as a part of area studies? I think in the case of Japan, it remains relevant because of our shared past, right? It was a brief encounter, but it was a tremendously difficult one. And I think it is maybe our responsibility today to continue to enrich our relations and to maybe address unaddressed traumas from that encounter, and to keep on talking what could lie ahead in terms of scholarship, politics, and living in Asia together as friendly neighbors, right? I hope that was a good answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Makes me nervous. Okay.
No, I don't know, Grace, you want to add something, or I can, because we have another question related to this topic. I can read the last one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
hi Flavia.
Okay, so please go.
There was no, people are saying that there was no sound.
Yes, but now it's okay. I think it was at the
Okay.
beginning of
Okay.
Professor Sato's comment.
Yeah. So yeah, thinking about the question on why I study colonialism in the Philippines, it's not, a few years ago, or maybe a decade ago, I would say, oh, I'm interested in Spanish colonization in the Philippines. But answering this question now, I would say I'm not studying the colonialism in the Philippines. I'm studying the strategies and the strategies of the local populations to fight or to counter colonialism in the Philippines. The area that I study mortuary burial practices, and recently expanded my work to looking at settlements in the Philippines. So what I'm interested in are the local practices that continued to be practiced or continued to be performed under the Spanish occupation, and what kind of material evidence do they live? What kind of material evidence are left in the sites? So that's why I'm interested in that particular period. It's not so much as what the Spanish did or what the Americans did in the Philippines, but how did the local population counter their presence? How were they able to perform their own rituals under the watchful eye of the Spanish priest, for example? And there are reports, but of course not extensive, of local healers or of Babaylans and Catalanans. So these are the ritual healers or local shamans, I think that's the closest translation in English. Okay, how would they perform? There are reports of them performing rituals outside of the town, in caves, in secluded areas, in forests. So there was a continuity and a continuation of these indigenous practices. At the same time, you cannot deny the impact of colonization also. How was this incorporated, and how did they transform these foreign practices, or the foreign concept, foreign materials in the local ritual? One hypothesis that I have is the material may change in terms of raw material. For example, pottery, we have clay. Well, it's still clay for porcelain, but the point is there are symbolisms and their use remain the same. So we have recorded practices, ethnographic practices, that if you ask the people now why they do it, they cannot give you a straightforward answer. But as a scholar, you can connect it to an earlier period, to an archaeological site, because you know that in the past this happened, and it leaves a tradition, or it leaves a trace in the modern world, which the modern population do not understand. But as a scholar, I think that's our duty to see the continuity of these practices, whether the use of materials or the concept also. So that's why I'm interested in this, what people would view as the colonial period. So my answer would also indicate that the local population are not passive recipients of the colonizing culture. And I think, this is what we want to highlight in our studies and the rest of the chapters in the book. Thank you.
Thank you. We don't have more time for any more questions. I'm sorry for those who wrote their question, but we don't have time to answer them all. So I have to really close today's session. I want to thank you once again and congratulate for your publication, Dr. Dada DOCOT and Dr. Grace BARRETTO-TESORO and all the other contributors and co-editors, of course. And I also want to thank Professor Sato for coming and comments for today's special event. I also want, of course, to thank the audience for being with us today. And also you can find the latest information about Tokyo College on our website, mailing magazine, and social media profiles. And I hope you can join us again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.